Okay, so myself and Kerry are going to talk a little bit about what happens in terms of supporting children into education. Most of the children that we're working with are preschool. We're picking them up as preschool children, but often one of the first questions that parents ask when they get a diagnosis is, will my child be able to go to their local school with their brothers and sisters and their friends? And for most of the children we see, the answer is going to be yes to that mainstream schools have got lots of children with autism, and that's the most appropriate place for them to be. So they're learning alongside their peers, and with extra support quite often. But certainly every school in Newcastle has got children with autism as part of their population. So that is going to be the case for most children, but obviously we know some children will need a higher level of support than that.
And I think it's such a worry for families, isn't it, Marie? Because obviously they're little people. All of a sudden, they're starting. The prospect of them starting school is a worry for any parent. And I think what I always say to families is, think about the unique support needs that your child might have, and then try and match that up with the provision. I think as well, the other thing to bear in mind is if your child might require a more specialist provision, then you're going to need evidence to be able to demonstrate that. So I think this is why groups like what we run, for example, we do parent and toddler groups across the region at North East Autism Society, and that's really useful in that we can start to build up a picture of that child through the early years, and that can then sometimes contribute to evidence for what does that child need when they get to that school nursery or reception class. So I think that's really important, is find out what support needs does your child have, and really looking at the environment, because the environment is key, isn't it, in all the work that we do with our children and families. It's about if a child really struggles, they have sensory differences with lots of noise and they can't cope with busy, noisy places, is a busy, noisy reception class going to work for them? And it's about trying to find that best fit. But I think it's a big worry for families, and I think it's difficult. It's a difficult system to navigate through.
It is, and I think it's again, we always say that children are individuals, and what works for one child and family won't work for others. So it is about getting that bigger picture of what's working already. And I think if your child is in a mainstream nursery now and is actually making progress and is happy to attend, then that's telling us a lot, that they can learn in that sort of environment. Obviously for other children, we can see that they're perhaps not reaching their potential, or they are very unsettled by being in a mainstream environment. And for those children we might need to look at some alternatives. So you might hear professionals talking about an education, health and care plan. So for some children who need a high level of support, and we need to think about, is this environment and, and the teaching support that's going in at the right level for them. So people might talk to you about an education, health and care plan, and that can be a bit scary, I think, hearing about that. It's obviously a statutory sort of process whereby a local authority is gathering information, that evidence you've already talked about. So they would ask the parent, as the most important person in the child's life, for evidence and reports, and you can contribute as much as you want to that. But also the education setting, the nursery, the teachers, you might have specialist support teachers going in, or nursery nurses. Myself as a speech and language therapist, I would often be asked to contribute a report. Medical paediatricians, occupational therapists, whoever else is involved, and educational psychology are the sort of big contributors as well to look at the child's learning. So that's a process of bringing all that information together and then producing a plan. I don't know if the families that you meet, Kerry, sort of have been through that process quite often.
Yeah, so many of the families I work with will have been through that process, but that's not to say every autistic child needs an education healthcare plan. I think that's a really important point. It isn't a given that they need or they will get that, actually. I think the bit before Marie is really important in that, schools need to be making reasonable adjustments. So, can we, introduce a movement break, for example, or can we implement some visual planning? What can we do before we need to go to that next step of applying for that education healthcare plan? And I think, for families, what I would say is have those open channels of communication with the school's special needs coordinator, otherwise known as a SENCO. Speak to the class teacher, because as well, Marie, you know, I'm thinking if you've got children that are in maybe parent and toddler groups or groups like what yourself is involved in at Great North Children's Hospital, it's a big transition, isn't it, for those children? So actually parents need to start thinking about it much earlier, really, because that's going to be a big jump from being in what is quite a free flowing environment to a more structured, you know, we need to sit at our desks, you know, and it's about being flexible. You know, I would always argue, does the child have to sit at the desk? Can we do work differently if that's what the child needs? But I think for parents, you need to think about it much earlier on to make that transition as smooth as possible.
Yeah. And I think for families, we would always say, apply for your local mainstream alongside all the other children, because that's really important. We can't predict sometimes what is going to happen and how much progress they might make. So always have that as your kind of insurance policy, that you have got a school place for your child. But then there are a group of children who will need something more specialist, and we need to acknowledge that and help families prepare for that. And I think it's always a good idea to have a look around, gather as much information as you can, because a lot of people don't have experience of what a specialist provision might look like, and they might have an image in their mind, but that might not be accurate. So I think just going and having a look and preparing yourself, so that when professionals might come to you and say, have you thought about this, or this might work for your child, it's really good to have a good image in your mind of what that would actually entail.
Absolutely. I think that's really important, Marie. What you've said is visiting the provisions, and visiting the provisions if you can when the children are in so it's, you know, a real life example of the school on that day. Because you're right, I think a lot of families don't know what specialist looks like because they may never have encountered it before. So yeah, I think that's really important.